I am James, 71 years old, and I recently sold my logistics empire for $80 million. To celebrate, my daughter Rachel and her husband Brian took me to the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. During the appetizers, I stepped away to take a business call. A terrified young waiter intercepted me in the hallway and whispered that my daughter had just poured the contents of a small vial into my glass of bourbon. I did not confront her. I simply returned to the table, created a brief distraction, and switched my glass with her husband's. 20 minutes later, Brian collapsed on the marble floor, convulsing violently. Before I reveal the rest of this story, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that greed always destroys those who embrace it. The private dining room at the downtown steakhouse smelled of expensive roasted garlic and aged leather. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table looking at the two people I had supported for the last 15 years. I had just finalized the sale of my company that morning. I built that logistics firm from a single used delivery truck into a national freight network through 50 years of relentless labor. The $80 million wire transfer was scheduled to clear into my primary account by Monday morning. I expected this dinner to be a moment of shared triumph. I was entirely wrong. My daughter Rachel sat to my right, swirling her expensive red wine. She had served as my vice president of finance for the past 5 years. She did not earn that title through merit. I gave it to her because I loved her and wanted her to understand the value of the family business. Instead of learning, she spent half a decade complaining about my conservative investment strategies. She constantly pushed me to leverage our assets to acquire high-risk tech startups. I always refused. She wanted the power of the CEO without ever putting in the exhausting hours required to build the foundation. When I told her I was selling the company to a corporate conglomerate instead of handing her the keys, her resentment hardened into a quiet, toxic anger. Her husband Brian sat across from her, cutting into a dry-aged ribeye with a smug expression. Brian was a man who owned many expensive suits, but had not held a steady job in a decade. I paid for their luxury vehicles. I funded the down payment on their massive suburban house. I even covered the extravagant vacations they took 4 times a year. Brian believed my wealth was his birthright, simply because he married my daughter. He looked at me across the table with a thinly veiled smirk, asking what an old man planned to do with $80 million. I ignored his disrespect. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my small silver pillbox. I extracted my daily beta blocker and swallowed it with a sip of water. I have lived with a moderate cardiac arrhythmia for 10 years. It is completely manageable with medication and routine checkups, but my family treats it like a ticking time bomb. Rachel watched me take the pill. Her eyes locked onto my hands. She smiled tightly and told me I needed to avoid stress. She said my heart was too fragile for the excitement of the company sale. She insisted that I needed to rest and let her handle the complex financial transitions. Her voice dripped with fake concern, but her eyes were cold and calculating. She did not want me to rest. She wanted me out of the way. My phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. The caller ID showed the name of my transition attorney, Lawson. He was calling to confirm the final escrow details. I excused myself from the table, stating I needed to take this call in a quiet space. I walked out of the private dining room and stepped into the dimly lit, velvet-lined hallway. Before I could even swipe the screen to answer the call, a hand grabbed my elbow. I spun around and saw a young waiter standing there. His name tag read, Leo. He was trembling. His face was entirely devoid of color. He looked over his shoulder toward the door of our private room, breathing heavily. He pulled me further down the hallway, away from the security cameras. He looked me directly in the eyes and told me he had just been adjusting the dessert cart near the cracked door of our room. He said he saw my daughter pull a small, dark glass vial from her designer purse. He watched her unscrew the cap and pour a clear liquid directly into my glass of premium bourbon. He explained that her husband Brian had deliberately shifted his chair and leaned across the table to block the view of the main floor while she did it. Leo begged me not to drink from that glass. He said he needed his job to pay for his college tuition and could not afford to be involved in a police investigation. But his conscience would not allow him to stay silent. The words hit my chest with the force of a physical blow. My daughter, my own flesh and blood. She was not just waiting for me to pass away. She was actively orchestrating my murder. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest as my arrhythmia flared, but I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. I commanded my heart to steady itself. Panic would achieve nothing. If I confronted them now, they would simply deny it. They would claim it was sweetener or medication. They would turn the situation around, accuse me of paranoid delusions, and use my outburst to prove I was mentally unfit. I needed absolute proof. I thanked Leo quietly. I promised him he would not lose his job. I slipped $100 bill into his apron pocket and told him to walk away and pretend we never spoke. I ended the ringing call from Lawson and stood in the hallway for 60 seconds. I locked my grief away in a dark corner of my mind. The father who loved his daughter died in that hallway. The businessman who built an empire emerged. I adjusted my tie, smoothed my jacket, and walked back into the private dining room. Rachel and Brian were laughing softly when I opened the door. They abruptly stopped and looked up at me with perfect, innocent expressions. My glass of bourbon sat exactly where I had left it, the amber liquid glowing under the warm pendant light. I walked to my chair and sat down. I looked at Rachel. I told her Lawson had just confirmed the $80 million would be fully accessible by Monday. I watched her eyes flash with a dark, greedy anticipation. She raised her wine glass and suggested we make a final toast to my long, healthy retirement. I reached for my bourbon. My fingers brushed the crystal glass. Then I deliberately knocked my white linen napkin off my lap. It fluttered to the floor, landing near Brian's expensive leather shoes. I sighed heavily, complaining about my clumsy old hands, and leaned down to retrieve it. Brian instinctively looked down under the table. Rachel glanced toward the doorway to see if a waiter was coming to replace it. In that single second of distracted vision, I moved with a speed and precision they did not know I possessed. I grabbed my glass of poisoned bourbon with my left hand, and Brian's identical glass of clean bourbon with my right. I crossed my arms silently over the table and swapped them. I sat back up, placing the clean napkin on my lap. I wrapped my fingers around Brian's glass. He wrapped his fingers around mine. I raised my drink and looked directly into my daughter's eyes. I toasted to family, to loyalty, and to receiving exactly what we deserve in this life. We clinked our glasses together. I took a deep swallow of the clean bourbon. Brian smiled arrogantly and drank half of the poisoned glass in one gulp. I placed my glass down and cut into my steak. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I engaged them in casual conversation about their upcoming vacation plans. I watched them closely. Rachel kept glancing at my chest, waiting for my breathing to become shallow. She was waiting for the digitalis to attack my vulnerable heart. She was waiting for the fatal cardiac event that she would seamlessly blame on my pre-existing condition and the stress of the corporate sale. Instead, Brian suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. He dropped his heavy silver fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie. A thick layer of cold sweat instantly coated his forehead. He gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table, his knuckles turning entirely white. Rachel looked at him in profound confusion. She asked him if he was feeling sick from the rich food. Brian tried to answer her, but only a low, guttural gasp escaped his throat. His eyes rolled back into his head. His chair tipped backward violently as his body went completely rigid. He crashed onto the hard marble floor. His arms and legs began to thrash in aggressive, uncontrollable convulsions. He violently knocked the side table over, sending expensive floral arrangements and glass plates shattering across the room. Rachel leaped from her chair. The mask of the calculating murderer vanished. replaced instantly by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a wife watching her husband die. She fell to her knees beside him, screaming his name hysterically. She grabbed his shoulders, trying to hold him still as he choked on his own saliva. She looked up at me, her face pale with absolute horror, screaming for me to call an ambulance. I sat perfectly still in my chair. I looked down at the empty glass of bourbon near Brian's foot. I pulled my phone from my pocket and calmly dialed emergency services. I reported a severe medical emergency. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of panic. I simply watched the brutal consequence of her own treachery unfold on the dining room floor. The paramedics arrived in less than 6 minutes. They burst into the private room with heavy medical equipment, shoving the broken glass aside. They immediately recognized the signs of severe cardiac distress. They loaded Brian onto the stretcher, securing oxygen over his face. Rachel grabbed her designer purse, sobbing wildly, and told the paramedics she was riding in the back of the ambulance with him. She turned to me, tears ruining her expensive makeup, and told me to go straight home. She insisted the shock was too much for my heart and promised to call me from the intensive care unit. I nodded slowly. I told her I would stay behind to settle the bill and handle the restaurant management. I watched the paramedics wheel her husband out the door. The moment the red and blue flashing lights disappeared down the city street, the adrenaline faded, leaving only a cold, sharp clarity. I had survived the assassination attempt. Now I needed the ammunition to destroy them completely. I walked out of the ruined private room and bypassed the host stand. I marched directly toward the heavy oak door marked for employees only. I found the restaurant general manager sitting in his small, cluttered office. He stood up immediately, apologizing profusely for the tragic medical emergency that ruined my celebration dinner. I raised my hand to silence him. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope containing $5,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. I always carry emergency funds. Tonight, that habit would save my life. I dropped the thick stack of bills onto the center of his desk. The manager stared at the money, his apology dying in his throat. I told him I did not want an apology. I told him I wanted the hard drive containing the security footage from the private dining room for the last 2 hours. He nervously stammered, claiming that corporate policy required a police subpoena for security footage. I stepped closer to his desk. I lowered my voice to a dangerous whisper. I explained that if he waited for a subpoena, the police would shut down his highly profitable restaurant for a full forensic investigation, costing him tens of thousands of dollars in lost revenue and permanently ruining the reputation of his establishment. I pushed the cash closer to his hands. I told him this was a private family matter that I was going to handle personally. The manager looked at the cash. He looked at my unblinking expression. He did not say another word. He turned around, unlocked a heavy metal cabinet, and disconnected a small black external hard drive from the main security server. He handed it to me in total silence. He swept the $5,000 into his desk drawer and locked it. I placed the hard drive securely into my interior jacket pocket. The digital proof of my daughter handing the poison to her husband was now completely under my control. The first piece of undeniable leverage was locked in. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped into the cold night air. Rachel thought she was going to inherit a fortune by Monday. She was about to discover that she had just triggered her own absolute ruin. The drive to the city hospital took exactly 14 minutes. I kept my hands steady on the leather steering wheel of my sedan. The cold night air blew through the vents, keeping my mind sharp and focused. The adrenaline from the restaurant had settled into a deep, freezing resolve. I pulled into the emergency parking lot, the stark red neon signs of the trauma center bleeding into the dark pavement. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a full minute. I needed to ensure my own heart rate was completely normal. I checked my pulse against my wrist. It was perfectly steady. The man who had almost been murdered was calm. The man who was about to destroy his own daughter was ready. I stepped out of the car and walked through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. The hospital was a chaotic maze of glaring fluorescent lights and sharp chemical smells. Nurses in blue scrubs hurried past with clipboards and medical carts. The air was thick with the quiet desperation of sick people and terrified families. I walked to the central reception desk and gave the attendant Brian's name. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, her face completely devoid of emotion, and pointed me toward the intensive care waiting area on the third floor. I took the elevator up, watching the digital numbers slowly change. Every second that passed was another second for my daughter to solidify her alibi. I stepped off the elevator and immediately saw her. Rachel was sitting in the center of the waiting room, surrounded by empty plastic chairs. She was putting on an absolute masterclass in deception. Her expensive designer coat was thrown carelessly onto the floor. Her makeup was expertly smudged beneath her eyes to simulate hours of desperate crying. She held a damp tissue in her trembling hands, occasionally dabbing at her face when a nurse walked by. I stood in the hallway for a moment, simply watching her. If I did not know the truth, if I had not seen the security footage secure in my pocket, I would have believed she was a grieving wife completely shattered by tragedy. She looked so small and vulnerable. It disgusted me. I walked into the room, making my footsteps heavy so she would hear me coming. Rachel snapped her head up. She leaped from her chair and ran across the room, throwing her arms around my neck. She sobbed loudly into my shoulder, gripping my jacket with desperate strength. She wailed about how unfair this was, how Brian was perfectly healthy just a few hours ago, and how terrified she was of losing him. I stood completely rigid. I raised my hand and patted her back slowly. I did not comfort her with empty words. I simply let her perform her theatrical grief. I felt the cold plastic of the hard drive pressing against my chest from inside my pocket, a silent promise of the ruin that was coming for her. Before Rachel could continue her performance, a set of heavy double doors swung open. A tall man in a crisp white lab coat walked into the waiting area. He looked exhausted, his brow furrowed with deep professional concern. He asked for the family of Brian. Rachel immediately detached herself from me and rushed toward him, practically begging for news. The doctor introduced himself as the chief toxicologist on call. He did not smile. He gestured for us to follow him into a small, windowless family consultation room down the hall. The room was claustrophobic, furnished with nothing but a round table and 3 uncomfortable chairs. The walls were painted a sterile, depressing gray. The doctor instructed us to sit down. He folded his hands on the table and looked directly at Rachel. He stated that Brian was currently stabilized and on a ventilator in the intensive care unit, but his condition remained incredibly critical. Rachel let out a loud, dramatic gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. I sat perfectly still, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I asked the doctor what exactly caused a healthy man in his 30s to suffer such a catastrophic cardiac collapse without any prior medical history. The toxicologist took a deep breath. He explained that when Brian first arrived, the trauma team assumed it was a massive myocardial infarction, a severe heart attack brought on by unknown congenital factors. However, the initial blood panels returned highly irregular results. He stated that the medical team immediately ordered a comprehensive toxicology screening. The doctor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious clinical whisper. He revealed that Brian did not have a natural heart attack. His blood contained a massive lethal concentration of digoxin, a powerful compound derived from the digitalis plant. The doctor explained that digitalis is a highly regulated medication used exclusively to treat severe congestive heart failure. In controlled microscopic doses, it helps the heart beat stronger. In the massive dose Brian ingested, it caused his heart to beat so violently and erratically that it effectively stopped pumping blood, leading to the violent convulsions and sudden collapse. The toxicologist looked back and forth between us. He stated that unless Brian had a secret prescription for heart failure that went drastically wrong, this was a deliberate and severe case of acute poisoning. Rachel executed her next move flawlessly. She let out a piercing scream. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the linoleum floor. She began pacing around the small room, hyperventilating, pulling at her own hair. She shouted that it was impossible. She cried out that someone must have tampered with his food at the steakhouse. She demanded that the police be called immediately to investigate the restaurant staff. She looked at me, her eyes wide with manufactured terror, and screamed that someone had tried to murder her husband. I watched her perform this elaborate lie with a chilling sense of clarity. She was laying the groundwork perfectly. By demanding a police investigation into the restaurant, she was creating a false trail, pointing the authorities away from herself and toward an anonymous kitchen worker or a contaminated bottle of wine. I looked at the doctor, who was already writing notes on his clipboard, clearly shaken by her dramatic outburst. I slowly stood up from my chair. I picked up her fallen chair and set it right. I placed my hand gently on my daughter's shoulder, feeling the tension in her muscles. I looked her directly in the eyes. I told her that we would find out exactly what happened tonight. I promised her that the person responsible for poisoning that glass would face the absolute maximum consequence. She stared back at me, tears streaming down her cheeks, completely unaware that I had just locked my trap around her. The heavy wooden door clicked shut as the toxicologist left the small consultation room. The silence he left behind lasted only a few seconds. Rachel immediately dropped the act of the weeping wife. Her posture straightened completely. The manufactured tears vanished from her cheeks. She paced across the gray linoleum floor, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the ground. She pulled her phone from her designer purse and began swiping across the screen with aggressive speed. She did not look at me. She spoke to the empty room, weaving her web of lies out loud to see exactly how it sounded. She declared that the steakhouse was entirely responsible for this tragedy. She theorized that a disgruntled kitchen worker must have targeted our private table. She claimed they probably intended to poison me because of my wealth and recent company sale. But Brian tragically took the wrong glass by mistake. It was a brilliant and terrifying pivot. She was planting the seed that I was the intended target, making her look like a secondary victim who was simply caught in the crossfire of corporate espionage. She began listing the names of high-powered civil litigation attorneys in the city. She swore she would bankrupt the restaurant. She promised to make sure the media knew exactly what happened to her husband. She talked about calling health inspectors and demanding a full forensic sweep of the restaurant kitchen. She was building a fortress of plausible deniability right in front of my eyes. I watched her fingers tap frantically on her screen. She was not texting a lawyer. I knew her behavioral patterns too well. She was calculating her timeline. With Brian in a medically induced coma and the poison officially identified, she needed to secure her financial position before the police started asking difficult questions. She finally locked her phone and turned to face me. The mask of the devoted daughter slipped back over her features seamlessly. She walked slowly toward my chair and prepared her next manipulative move. She knelt on the cold floor and placed her warm hands over mine. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. She told me I looked terrible. She pointed out the slight tremor in my left hand, a tremor I was deliberately faking to sell my performance of a terrified father. She reminded me of my cardiac arrhythmia. She said the stress of sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room all night would trigger a fatal heart attack. She whispered that she could not bear to lose her husband and her father on the exact same night. The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me laugh, but I kept my face entirely rigid. I told her I wanted to stay because I needed to be here for Brian. She squeezed my hands tighter, her nails digging slightly into my skin. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a physical command. She insisted that I go back to my house immediately. She promised to sit by his bed every single second and monitor his machines. She swore she would call me the moment there was any change in his condition. She told me I needed to go to my bedroom, take my medication, and sleep until the morning. She was pushing me out the door with relentless force. A daughter truly terrified for her husband would want her family close for emotional support. Rachel wanted me isolated and unconscious. She needed me away from the hospital, so I could not speak to the police detectives when they inevitably arrived to take an official statement. More importantly, she needed me away from my corporate laptop. She stood up and grabbed my heavy winter coat from the back of the chair. She held it open for me, literally forcing me to put it on. She guided my arms into the sleeves, like I was a helpless child. She patted my chest exactly where my vulnerable heart was beating. She told me to trust her and promised she had everything completely under control. I looked at her face, studying the tiny details of her expression. I saw the raw, unchecked greed hiding just behind her feigned concern. She thought she had won. She believed I was just a tired old man broken by the shock of the evening, ready to crawl into bed and fade away. I slowly nodded my head. I let my shoulders slump forward to mimic profound exhaustion. I thanked her for being so strong for both of us. I promised her I would go straight home and get some rest. She walked me out of the consultation room and guided me toward the elevator banks. She pressed the down button for me. She stood by my side until the metal doors slid open. She kissed my cheek, her lips feeling like ice against my skin. She told me she loved me. I stepped into the empty elevator car and pressed the button for the ground floor lobby. I looked back at her as the doors began to close. She was already turning away, her phone back in her hand, her thumb swiping furiously across the screen. The elevator descended silently. The performance was over. The tired old man vanished the moment I was alone. I walked through the main hospital lobby with a swift, purposeful stride. I bypassed the valet stand and walked directly to my car in the dark parking lot. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Rachel wanted me to go home and sleep. She wanted me to leave the family finances in her capable hands. I put the car in gear and drove out of the hospital gates. I was going home, but I had absolutely no intention of sleeping. I needed to see exactly what she was doing on that phone. I needed to see how deep her betrayal truly went. The tires of my sedan crunched softly against the gravel driveway of my estate. The house was completely dark and entirely silent. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the expansive foyer. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a heavy and rhythmic sound. Normally, this silence brought me immense peace after a long day of corporate negotiations. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. I did not bother turning on the main lights. I navigated the familiar hallways by the faint moonlight filtering through the large windows. I walked directly to the back of the house and entered my private study. This was the room where I had built my logistics empire over 5 decades. The walls were lined with leather-bound books and framed maps of my early delivery routes. This room represented a lifetime of grueling sacrifice and honest labor. My daughter was trying to erase all of it in a single night. I walked around my large oak desk and sat down in my heavy leather chair. I pressed the power button on my desktop computer. The large monitor flared to life and cast a cold blue glow across the dark room. I opened the encrypted portal to my corporate financial servers. This system was designed with maximum security protocols to protect the assets of a national freight network. It required a physical security token, a complex password, and biometric authentication. I inserted the token into the drive. I placed my thumb on the glowing scanner. The screen flashed green. I typed my 60-character passphrase without looking at the keyboard. The system granted me access. I immediately navigated to the master executive dashboard. I needed to verify the absolute security of the $80 million corporate buyout funds before I could plan my next move. The main ledger loaded onto the screen. I stared at the numbers, and my breath caught in my throat. The total balance was entirely wrong. The corporate buyout funds were securely resting in the main holding account, but a massive deduction was flagged in the pending transaction queue. I leaned closer to the monitor and narrowed my eyes at the digital rows. A wire transfer for exactly $15 million had been initiated. It was currently marked as processing. The destination was not one of our registered corporate vendors or domestic logistics partners. The routing numbers pointed directly to an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. My heart hammered against my ribs. This time it was not a medical symptom. It was pure and unadulterated rage. I clicked on the transaction details to expand the routing history. I needed to know exactly how this breach occurred. The system logs revealed exactly when the transfer was initiated. The timestamp showed 8:45 in the evening. That was precisely the moment I had stepped out of the private dining room at the steakhouse to take the phone call from my attorney. While I was standing in the restaurant hallway, listening to a terrified waiter warn me about the poison, my daughter was sitting at the mahogany table, transferring $15 million out of my company. She used her phone right under my nose. As Vice President of Finance, Rachel possessed the secondary security clearance required to draft large outbound transfers. I gave her that access because I trusted her completely. However, she did not have the authority to finalize them. Any transaction over $1 million strictly required my primary digital signature and my unique executive authorization code. I opened the authorization document attached to the pending offshore wire transfer. The file loaded slowly onto my screen. There at the bottom of the digital authorization form was my exact signature. It was not a clumsy copy or a forged paper document. It was a flawless digital reproduction. She had stolen my private executive authorization code and successfully bypassed the dual authentication protocols. She had likely been watching me type my credentials for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sheer brilliance of her malice became absolutely clear as I analyzed the banking timeline. She knew the corporate banking systems paused major offshore transactions over the weekend for final fraud review. She initiated the $15 million transfer on Friday night because she knew it would sit in the pending queue until Monday morning. She also knew that if I died from a sudden cardiac event on Friday night, there would be no one alive to cancel the transaction when the banks opened. By the time the corporate auditors discovered the missing $15 million, the money would be buried in an untraceable Caribbean account. I would be dead, her husband would be the grieving widower, and she would be a tremendously wealthy woman with zero ties to the missing funds. She did not just want her inheritance early. She wanted to strip the company bare before the corporate conglomerate could finalize the buyout. She was willing to murder her father and risk the entire $80 million deal just to guarantee her own secret fortune. I stared at the forged signature on the glowing monitor. Rachel believed she had outsmarted the old man. She believed the money was already hers. She did not realize that by initiating the transfer, before I was actually dead, she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her completely. The digital trail was undeniable proof of her financial crimes. It perfectly corroborated the attempted murder. I reached across the dark desk and picked up my phone. The digital clock on my computer read 2 in the morning. I needed to wake up my attorney. We had a trap to set. The digital clock glowing on my dark mahogany desk read exactly 2:15 in the morning. I did not feel fatigue. The adrenaline coursing through my veins had completely erased any physical exhaustion. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a private number I had memorized over 30 years ago. It was the direct line to Lawson. He was not just my primary corporate attorney. He was the ruthless architect of my legal defense since the days I only owned 3 rusting delivery trucks and operated out of a damp garage. He was a man who slept with his phone resting on his nightstand, specifically for moments of absolute crisis. The line rang 3 times in the quiet room before he answered. His voice was thick with sleep, but he was instantly alert. He asked me what was wrong. He knew my habits perfectly. He knew I would never call him at this hour of the night, unless the logistics company was facing an existential threat. I kept my voice entirely level and devoid of emotion. I told him the company was perfectly fine, but my only daughter had just attempted to murder me and was currently stealing $15 million from our corporate holding account. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and heavy. For a brief moment, I thought the cellular connection had dropped. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of Lawson throwing off his heavy bedsheets and walking rapidly across the hardwood floor of his bedroom. He did not ask if I was confused. He did not question my sanity or suggest I was having a terrible nightmare. He simply asked me exactly where I was and if I was currently safe from physical harm. I assured him I was locked securely inside my home office at the estate and completely unharmed. I explained the events of the evening with cold precision. I told him how a brave young waiter warned me about the poisoned bourbon. I told him how I switched the glasses. I told him Brian was currently lying in a medically induced coma at the city hospital because he drank the lethal dose of digitalis his own wife had poured into my drink. I heard Lawson exhale a sharp and ragged breath. He told me he was booting up his secure legal terminal immediately. He instructed me to stay on the line and read him the exact transaction identification number from the pending offshore wire transfer. I leaned closer to my glowing computer monitor and read the 12-digit alphanumeric code aloud. I heard his mechanical keyboard clacking aggressively through the phone speaker. A minute later, he cursed softly under his breath. He confirmed he had successfully accessed the master ledger. He told me he could see the $15 million transfer pending in the queue. He saw the final destination was an untraceable shadow corporation, registered in the Cayman Islands. He also saw the forged digital signature utilizing my private executive authorization code. Lawson told me he was initiating an immediate hard cancellation of the wire transfer right now. He said he would instantly flag her secondary authorization account for extreme corporate fraud and lock her completely out of the internal network. He told me he was going to call the federal authorities and send the local police to her house to arrest her for attempted murder and grand larceny before the sun came up. I told him to stop. I commanded him in my sternest executive voice to take his hands off his keyboard immediately. He paused and asked me why in the world we would let a $15 million fraudulent transaction remain active in our system. I explained my reasoning with absolute clarity. I told him that if we cancel the transfer right now, she will receive an automated alert on her mobile phone. She is currently sitting in the hospital waiting room, staring at her screen. She will know immediately that I am alive and that I have discovered her massive theft. She will panic, but she will also have time to prepare. She will destroy her phone and any digital evidence linking her to the Cayman Islands account. She will hire a team of vicious defense lawyers using the money I already gave her. She will claim the transfer was a legitimate corporate investment strategy and that I actually authorized it before a sudden medical episode confused my memory. She will drag this out in civil and criminal court for a decade. I told Lawson I did not want a prolonged legal battle. I wanted total and inescapable annihilation. I wanted to trap her so perfectly that no lawyer on earth could save her. Lawson remained quiet for a long time as he absorbed my strategy. He finally asked me what exactly I wanted to do. I reminded him of a complex federal wire fraud case we assisted the authorities with 5 years ago, involving a corrupt international shipping vendor. During that specific case, we worked very closely with a specialized unit of financial crimes investigators. I asked Lawson if he still had the direct contact information for the lead federal agent on that task force. He confirmed he still had the number in his secure directory. I told him my plan. I did not want to cancel the transfer. I wanted to legally reroute the receiving destination. I wanted the $15 million to leave my corporate account exactly as Rachel planned, but I did not want it to land in her offshore shell company. I wanted it to drop directly into a federal sting account, monitored and controlled entirely by the Financial Crimes Division. Lawson let out a low whistle of astonishment. He explained the extreme technical and legal complexity of what I was demanding. To intercept a pending wire transfer without alerting the original initiator requires bypassing the standard banking interface entirely. We would need to access the deepest administrative layers of the Federal Reserve routing system. We would need the federal agent to wake up a judge and authorize an emergency digital seizure warrant in the middle of the night. We would need to create a mirrored destination account that looked absolutely identical to her Cayman Islands routing number on the surface, but secretly funneled the capital into strict government custody. Lawson warned me it was incredibly risky. If the automated bank security algorithms detected the mid-air route change, they might trigger a massive security protocol and freeze the entire $80 million corporate buyout fund automatically. I told him I built this logistics empire from nothing by taking calculated risks. I told him to make the call to the federal agent immediately. Lawson placed me on a secure encrypted hold. I sat alone in my dark office staring intently at the glowing monitor. The transaction status on my screen still read pending. Every single minute that passed felt like an eternity. The large house was dead silent, except for the harsh ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I thought about the pale pink dress I bought for her high school graduation. I thought about the tears of joy in my eyes when I walked her down the aisle to marry a man I already knew was worthless. I realized then that the sweet daughter I loved had died a very long time ago. The greedy and entitled woman sitting in the hospital waiting room was a total stranger who just happened to wear her face. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The phone finally clicked back over to the active line. Lawson was breathing heavily. He told me the federal agent was awake and fully engaged. The agent had securely viewed the forged signature and the illegal offshore routing attempt. They were officially treating this as a massive corporate espionage and attempted murder case. Lawson told me I needed to personally authorize the routing override from my end of the terminal. A new security prompt suddenly appeared on my computer screen. It was a direct encrypted link to the Federal Financial Crimes Portal. It required my biometric thumbprint scan and my vocal authorization. Lawson instructed me to read the legal waiver aloud for the federal recording. I leaned close to the high-definition microphone resting on my desk. I stated clearly that I was James, the sole owner and chief executive officer of the logistics company. I stated that I was voluntarily authorizing the federal government to intercept the fraudulent wire transfer initiated by my vice president of finance. I placed my right thumb firmly on the biometric scanner. The security system processed the physical data. A blue loading bar appeared on the screen. It moved agonizingly slowly across the monitor. Lawson told me the federal servers were actively establishing the mirrored destination account. The progress bar reached 99% and suddenly froze. My heart pounded aggressively against my ribs. If the system failed now, Rachel would get away with everything. Suddenly the screen flashed a brilliant green. A confirmation message appeared in bold white letters stating the destination routing number had been successfully overwritten. The $15 million were now locked securely onto a one-way track into a federal holding facility. On the dashboard Rachel was monitoring the transaction would still appear perfectly normal. It would look exactly like her untraceable Cayman Islands account. She would not know the terrifying truth until she tried to withdraw the money on Monday morning. By the time she realized the money was gone, the federal agents would already have the metal handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists. Lawson let out a massive sigh of relief through the phone. He told me the financial trap was completely and legally set. He asked me what my next strategic move was. I looked away from the monitor and stared at the small black external hard drive sitting on my desk. It contained the high-definition security footage from the private dining room. It was the undeniable video proof of Brian shifting his chair to block the camera while Rachel poured the lethal digitalis into my drink. I told Lawson that the financial trap was only half of the equation. I needed absolute legal leverage to ensure she never saw the outside of a prison cell again. I needed a full written confession from her partner in crime. I told Lawson I was going to visit my son-in-law in the intensive care unit first thing in the morning. I was going to use the video to break his spirit and force him to turn against his own wife to save himself. Lawson warned me to be incredibly careful. He reminded me that cornered animals are highly unpredictable and dangerous. I thanked him for his decades of loyalty and ended the call. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and watched the dark sky slowly begin to turn gray outside my window. The long night of betrayal was finally over. The morning of absolute retribution had arrived. I did not sleep a single minute after my phone call with Lawson. I spent the remaining hours of the dark morning sitting in my heavy leather chair and watching the sun slowly rise over my manicured lawn. The golden light of dawn washed over the estate. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. I stood up and walked to my adjoining bathroom. I washed my face with ice-cold water. I shaved with meticulous precision. I chose my clothing very carefully. I selected a charcoal gray tailored suit and a deep crimson tie. This was the exact suit I wore when I hostilely took over a rival logistics firm a decade ago. It was my armor. I checked my inner pocket to ensure the small black external hard drive was still resting safely inside. I walked out of my quiet house and got back into my car. The drive to the hospital felt entirely different in the daylight. The terror of the previous night had completely evaporated. I was no longer an old man reacting to a sudden assassination attempt. I was the predator, calmly returning to finish the hunt. I walked through the main hospital lobby with a slow and measured stride. The chaotic energy of the Friday night emergency room was gone. It was replaced by the quiet hum of the weekend shift. I bypassed the crowded public elevators and used my corporate access card to take the private staff elevator up to the intensive care floor. I had donated heavily to this hospital over the years, and those donations afforded me certain silent privileges. The metal doors opened on the 4th floor. I did not walk directly into the main ward. I stood perfectly still in the shadow of a supply closet near the corner of the hallway. I looked down the long corridor and found her. Rachel was sitting in a hard plastic chair outside room 412. She looked genuinely exhausted. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled. Her perfect hair was messy. She was aggressively rubbing her temples while staring at her phone. I knew exactly what she was looking at. She was staring at the digital dashboard of the Cayman Islands Shell account. She was desperately waiting for Monday morning so the $15 million would clear. She had absolutely no idea the money was currently sitting in a federal Sting account. I stayed hidden in the shadows and watched her breathe. I needed her to leave the hallway. I knew her patience for physical discomfort was incredibly low. I just had to wait for her entitlement to override her caution. 10 minutes passed slowly. Then 20 minutes crawled by. Finally, Rachel let out a loud and frustrated sigh. She shoved her phone into her designer purse and stood up. She walked over to the central nurses' station. She leaned across the tall counter and demanded to know where the closest premium coffee shop was located. She complained loudly about the terrible quality of the hospital cafeteria food. The nurse politely pointed her toward a luxury cafe located down on the ground floor lobby. Rachel nodded sharply and walked toward the public elevators. She did not even look back at her husband's room. She pressed the down button and waited. The elevator chimed and the metal doors opened. She stepped inside and disappeared from my view. I looked at the digital clock on the wall above the nurses' station. It read exactly 9:15 in the morning. I calculated the distance and the typical waiting line at that specific cafe. I knew I had exactly 12 minutes before she returned with her expensive beverage. 12 minutes was more than enough time to dismantle a man's entire life. I stepped out of the shadows and walked confidently down the bright hallway. I did not sneak or hide. I walked with the heavy authority of a man who owned the building. The nurses were busy checking monitors and updating medical charts. None of them questioned the wealthy older gentleman walking purposefully toward room 412. I gripped the silver handle of the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. I stepped inside the intensive care unit and immediately pulled the door shut behind me. I reached down and engaged the heavy metal deadbolt lock with a loud and final click. I turned around and looked at the room. It smelled of strong bleach and metallic copper. The space was dominated by a massive mechanical ventilator and several towers of glowing digital monitors. Brian was lying in the center of the mechanical bed. He was no longer in a medically induced coma. The doctors had removed the breathing tube earlier that morning. He had a clear plastic oxygen mask strapped tightly over his nose and mouth. His skin was the color of dirty ash. He looked incredibly weak and pathetic. All of the arrogant swagger he carried at the steakhouse was entirely gone. He was nothing but a fragile shell of a man connected to a wall of beeping machines. His eyes fluttered open when he heard the heavy door lock engage. He turned his head slowly toward me. He expected to see his wife returning to comfort him. Instead, he saw the man he had tried to murder just 12 hours ago. The profound confusion in his pale eyes quickly melted into pure and absolute terror. His heart monitor immediately began to beep faster. The green lines spiked aggressively across the digital screen as his pulse raced. He tried to sit up, but his muscles completely failed him. He fell heavily back against the thin hospital pillows. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a weak, rasping sound escaped his dry throat. I did not say a single word to him yet. I wanted the silence to suffocate him. I walked slowly across the sterile room and approached the large window overlooking the busy city street. I grabbed the plastic cord and pulled it down firmly. The heavy vinyl blinds snapped shut. The bright morning sunlight was instantly eliminated from the room. We were plunged into a heavy and artificial darkness, lit only by the glowing green lines of his medical equipment. I walked over to the side of his bed and looked down at his terrified face. He was completely trapped. His wife was gone. The door was locked. The room was dark. He was entirely at my mercy, and he knew it. I pulled a heavy metal visitor chair across the linoleum floor. The scraping sound was incredibly loud in the quiet room. I positioned the chair inches from the side of his mechanical bed. I sat down slowly and crossed my legs. I looked at the digital readout on his heart monitor. His pulse was racing at 140 beats per minute. I finally spoke. I kept my voice incredibly soft and completely devoid of anger. I told him he was looking at the wrong man with that expression of absolute terror. I told him I was not the person who put him in this hospital bed. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out my large digital tablet. I had transferred the files from the external hard drive earlier that morning. I grabbed the adjustable hospital table resting at the foot of his bed. I swung it around and positioned it directly over his chest. I placed the tablet perfectly in the center of the table. I angled the high-definition screen so he had absolutely no choice but to look directly at it. He stared at the blank screen with wide and panicked eyes. His breathing was rapid and shallow inside the plastic oxygen mask. Condensation was building up rapidly on the clear plastic. He tried to turn his head away from the table. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on his right shoulder. I pressed him down into the mattress. I told him he needed to pay very close attention to this presentation. I tapped the screen and opened the video file. The security footage from the private dining room began to play in sharp black and white. I paused the video right at the exact moment I stood up from the mahogany table to answer my phone call. I pointed at the screen. I told him this was the exact second my transition attorney called me to confirm the corporate buyout funds. I told him to look very closely at the man sitting across from my empty chair. I watched Brian stare at his own digital reflection. He was watching the ghost of his own arrogance from just 12 hours ago. I pressed the play button again. The silent video continued. I leaned closer to his ear and narrated the events unfolding on the screen like a cold and detached documentary. I told him to watch how smoothly he operated. I pointed at the digital version of him shifting his chair backward. I pointed out how he deliberately leaned his wide shoulders to the left. I explained that I knew he was intentionally creating a visual blind spot from the main dining room doors. His heart monitor beeped faster as he watched himself facilitate his own murder plot. Then I pointed to Rachel. I traced my finger along the screen as her hand reached into her expensive designer purse. I told Brian to look at his beautiful wife. I made him watch as she pulled out the small glass vial. The high-definition camera captured the exact moment she unscrewed the black plastic cap. It captured the exact moment she poured the lethal digitalis directly into my crystal glass of premium bourbon. Brian closed his eyes. He squeezed them shut as tightly as he could. He violently shook his head from side to side against the thin pillow. A pathetic whining sound escaped from the back of his throat. I did not let him hide in the dark. I squeezed his shoulder harder. I commanded him to open his eyes and finish watching the scene. I told him he did not get the luxury of looking away from his own actions. He slowly opened his eyes. Tears were now streaming down the sides of his pale face and soaking into his hospital gown. I fast-forwarded the video slightly. I stopped it right when I re-entered the private dining room. I let the video play at normal speed. I watched Brian watch the fatal exchange. He saw me drop my white linen napkin. He saw himself look away for a fraction of a second. He saw my hands move with absolute precision as I swapped our identical glasses. He let out a loud gasp that fogged his oxygen mask completely. The realization of his own fatal stupidity finally crashed down upon him. He watched himself pick up the poisoned glass. He watched himself drink the lethal dose his own wife had poured. I tapped the screen and the video went black. The only light remaining in the room was the harsh glow of the medical monitors. I leaned back in my heavy metal chair. I folded my hands perfectly in my lap. I asked him how it felt to know he was sitting in a hospital bed because of a napkin. I told him the toxicologist confirmed the massive dose of digitalis in his blood last night. I told him the local police were currently treating this as an attempted murder investigation. Brian began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved up and down in rapid and shallow jerks. He tried to speak through the plastic mask. His voice was incredibly weak and raspy. He begged me to understand. He swore he did not want to do it. He blamed everything entirely on Rachel. He claimed she manipulated him and threatened to leave him destitute if he did not help her steal the corporate buyout funds. He was crying hysterically now. The arrogant son-in-law who mocked me at the dinner table was completely gone. He was replaced by a pathetic and broken coward desperately trying to save his own skin. I listened to his pathetic excuses without a single shred of sympathy. I let him babble and cry until his throat gave out, and he fell into a violent coughing fit. I waited for the coughing to subside. I leaned forward again. I brought my face just inches from his plastic oxygen mask. I told him I did not care about his excuses. I told him I did not care who came up with the idea. I told him the video on my tablet was enough to send him to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of his miserable life. I explained that the prosecutor would love this high-definition footage. I told him he would be convicted of first-degree attempted murder and corporate conspiracy before the end of the year. I watched the last remaining spark of hope completely extinguish in his pale eyes. He was entirely broken. The psychological foundation of his life was reduced to dust. He was staring directly at his own destruction, and he knew there was absolutely no way out. The psychological trap was perfectly set. Now I just needed him to give me the final piece of the puzzle. I watched the pathetic tears stream down his face for another full minute. I did not offer him a tissue to dry his eyes. I did not offer him a single drop of water to soothe his burning throat. I wanted him to feel the absolute crushing weight of his own mortality. He was lying in a hospital bed, attached to a mechanical breathing machine, entirely because he had decided to play a deadly game with a man who had spent 5 decades destroying ruthless corporate rivals. I told him he needed to stop crying and listen to me very carefully. I told him he had exactly 2 choices today, and neither of them ended with him walking out of this hospital as a free man. I explained that his wife was currently sitting in the public lobby drinking a premium latte and waiting for Monday morning to arrive. I told him Rachel was not crying over his hospital bed, and she was certainly not praying for his swift recovery. I told him she was actively preparing to sacrifice him to the authorities the moment the police asked her a single difficult question. I watched his eyes dart around the dark room as the terrible reality of his isolation finally set in. Brian tried to shake his head, but he lacked the physical strength to move his neck. I leaned closer to the metal bed rails. I laid out his first option, with cold and absolute precision. I told him I could stand up right now and walk directly to the local police station down the street. I would hand the lead homicide detective the digital tablet containing the high-definition security footage. I would let a team of uniformed officers march into this intensive care unit and arrest him in this very hospital bed. I told him that without my immense financial support, he would be forced to rely on an overworked public defender. I explained that a public defender would take one look at the undeniable video of him shielding a murder plot and immediately advise him to take a plea deal for 30 years in a maximum security state penitentiary. I painted a vivid and horrifying picture of his future. I described the towering concrete walls and the violent environment. I reminded him that he was an incredibly soft man who had never worked a hard physical day in his entire life. I told him a maximum security prison would completely break his mind and his body within a single month. He stared at me with wide eyes full of absolute terror because he knew I was telling the exact truth. Then I offered him the second option. I told him I was a pragmatic businessman and I was willing to negotiate a transaction with him. I told him I wanted a full written confession detailing every single aspect of Rachel and her master plan. I told him I wanted exact dates and specific times. I wanted the precise details of how they procured the lethal digitalis from the internet. I wanted it written entirely in his own handwriting and signed with his own legal signature. In exchange for this absolute surrender, I promised to pay for the most expensive and ruthless criminal defense attorney in the state to represent him. I promised to use my extensive political connections and my financial influence to ensure he served a significantly reduced sentence in a minimum security white-collar federal facility. I told him he would have a comfortable mattress and decent food and access to a library. I told him he would be surrounded by disgraced accountants and fallen executives instead of violent criminals. I told him it was the absolute best deal he would ever receive in his entire life, and it was only available right now. Brian hesitated for a moment. He looked away from my face and stared at the glowing green lines on his heart monitor. He whispered through his plastic oxygen mask that he could not betray his wife. He said Rachel would absolutely destroy him in court if he turned against her. I let out a cold and humorless laugh that echoed in the dark hospital room. I decided it was time to drop the final psychological hammer and shatter his remaining loyalty. I told him Rachel had already betrayed him. I revealed the absolute truth about the missing corporate funds. I told him that while he was lying on the expensive restaurant floor, violently choking on his own saliva, Rachel was using her mobile phone to initiate a $15 million wire transfer to an untraceable shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I watched the profound shock register on his pale and sweaty face. I explained that she flawlessly forged my digital signature and completely bypassed the corporate security protocols while he was dying. I told him she never planned to share that massive fortune with him. I told him she deliberately set him up to take the ultimate fall for the poison while she secured her own secret wealth. I asked him why in the world he was protecting a woman who was perfectly willing to let him die just to ensure she received her inheritance a few years early. The fight completely drained out of his fragile body. His broad shoulders slumped heavily against the thin hospital mattress. He looked down at his trembling hands resting on his stomach. He finally realized he was nothing but a disposable and pathetic pawn in his wife and her sick game of corporate treason. He looked back up at me and nodded his head slowly. He agreed to all of my ruthless terms. I did not waste a single second of his compliance. I opened my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick pad of yellow legal paper. I retrieved a heavy black fountain pen from my inside suit jacket pocket. I grabbed the adjustable hospital table and positioned the yellow pad directly over his chest. I uncapped the fountain pen and placed it securely into his trembling right hand. I told him to start writing immediately. I stood over him like a prison warden watching an inmate. I meticulously dictated the exact structure of the legal confession. I made him write down his full legal name and the current date at the top of the page. I made him state clearly that he was writing this document of his own free will without any physical coercion or illegal duress. I watched his pale hand shake violently as he dragged the metal tip of the pen across the yellow paper. The massive dose of digitalis had severely weakened his muscles, and his breathing was incredibly labored, but I did not care about his physical suffering. I forced him to keep writing the truth. He detailed exactly how Rachel spent the last several weeks aggressively complaining about my conservative financial strategies. He wrote down how she secretly purchased the small glass vial of liquid digitalis from an anonymous international vendor on the dark web. He explicitly detailed how they meticulously planned the celebration dinner at the steakhouse for the sole purpose of slipping the poison into my premium bourbon. He wrote down how he deliberately shifted his heavy wooden chair to block the view of the main dining room floor so she could safely pour the lethal dose. He confessed to every single treacherous detail of their conspiracy. It took him 20 agonizing minutes to fill 3 entire pages of the yellow legal pad. Cold sweat poured down his pale face and completely soaked into the stiff collar of his hospital gown. He had to stop writing several times to catch his breath through the plastic oxygen mask. His chest heaved with exhaustion. I simply stood there silently in the dark room and waited for him to recover before tapping my finger on the paper to make him continue. He finally reached the bottom of the 3rd page. I told him to sign his legal name and write the exact time next to his signature. He pressed the heavy fountain pen to the paper and signed the document. The pen slipped slightly at the end of his last name because his hand was shaking so badly, but the signature was entirely legible and legally binding. He dropped the pen onto the table, and it rolled off the edge, hitting the linoleum floor. He collapsed backward against his pillows, completely drained of all energy. He looked at me with hollow and dead eyes. He asked me in a broken whisper if I was really going to keep my promise to him. I carefully picked up the 3 pages of yellow paper from the table. I blew softly on the wet black ink to dry it completely. I folded the heavy pages neatly and placed them securely into the inside breast pocket of my charcoal suit jacket, right next to the digital hard drive. I looked down at his pathetic face and told him I always honor my corporate contracts. I told him he would absolutely get his expensive defense lawyer and his comfortable white-collar prison cell. I told him he had finally made the only intelligent decision of his entire miserable life. I turned around and unlocked the heavy hospital door. I had successfully secured the final piece of undeniable leverage. I now held the digital proof of the massive theft and the video proof of the attempted murder and the written proof of the entire conspiracy. I was fully armed and entirely ready for the final war. I reached out and unlocked the heavy metal deadbolt with a loud click. The exact moment I turned the latch, the door handle was violently twisted from the outside. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Rachel stormed into the dim intensive care unit. She was holding a large iced coffee in her right hand. The artificial light from the bright hallway spilled into the dark room and illuminated her face. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes rapidly scanned the horrifying scene in front of her. She saw the heavy vinyl blinds pulled tightly shut against the morning sun. She saw her husband lying flat on the mechanical mattress, weeping uncontrollably into his plastic oxygen mask. Then she saw me standing calmly at the foot of his bed. I was meticulously buttoning my charcoal suit jacket and sliding 3 folded yellow pages into my inside breast pocket. The mask of the concerned and grieving wife completely vanished from her face. She dropped her expensive coffee cup directly onto the hospital floor. The plastic shattered, and dark liquid splashed across the white linoleum, but she did not even blink. She marched toward me with her hands curled into tight fists. She demanded to know exactly what I was doing in her husband and his room. She asked why the lights were off, and why I was harassing a man who was desperately fighting for his life. I did not raise my voice or show any defensive posture. I simply looked down at the spilled coffee soaking into my expensive leather shoes. I told her I was just having a very quiet and productive conversation with my son-in-law about loyalty and the severe consequences of terrible financial decisions. Rachel immediately turned her attention to Brian. She rushed to the side of his mechanical bed and tried to grab his hand to comfort him. She told him I was a paranoid old man and begged him to ignore whatever crazy lies I had just told him. Brian reacted precisely the way I knew he would. He violently snatched his hand away from her grip. He pressed his entire body back against the far side of the mattress, as if her physical touch burned his skin. He looked at the woman he had loved for 5 years with an expression of absolute disgust and sheer terror. He told her in a broken whisper to stay completely away from him. He told her he knew exactly what she did with the corporate accounts while he was choking on the restaurant floor. He told her she was a monster, and he was never going to spend a single day in a federal prison to protect her secret offshore fortune. The color completely drained from the face of my daughter. The perfect foundation of her master plan cracked wide open right in front of my eyes. She stared at Brian as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Then she slowly turned her head and looked directly at the yellow legal pad resting on the adjustable hospital table. She saw the torn edges at the top of the cardboard binding. She looked at the heavy fountain pen lying discarded on the floor near my feet. She finally looked at the breast pocket of my suit jacket, where I had just tucked the folded pages. She realized exactly what I possessed. She knew her husband had just written a full legal confession detailing every single aspect of her murderous conspiracy and corporate theft. Pure animal panic completely consumed her. She lunged forward and tried to grab the lapels of my suit jacket. She screamed that I was completely insane and demanded that I give her those pieces of paper immediately. I easily caught her wrists in midair. I held her arms suspended in the space between us. My grip was entirely firm and unyielding. I looked deeply into her panicked eyes. I saw the arrogant vice president of finance completely dissolve into a terrified criminal facing absolute ruin. I told her softly that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I explained that she spent her entire adult life underestimating my intelligence simply because I loved her as a father. I let go of her wrists and pushed her gently backward. She stumbled and caught her balance against the edge of the medical cart. I turned my back on her and walked toward the open hospital door. She shouted after me that I had absolutely no proof of anything. She claimed Brian was heavily medicated and completely delusional from the lethal poison. She swore that any confession written under those specific medical conditions would be thrown out by a judge in 5 seconds. She screamed that I was a senile old man hallucinating a grand conspiracy because my brain was failing. I stopped in the doorway and looked back at her over my shoulder. I did not correct her assumptions. I did not tell her about the high-definition security footage currently resting in my pocket right next to the written confession. I definitely did not tell her that her $15 million offshore wire transfer was currently sitting safely inside a federal government sting account. I simply smiled a cold and empty smile. I told her to enjoy her weekend because Monday morning was going to bring a very harsh reality. I walked out of the intensive care unit and left her standing in the dark room with the shattered pieces of her marriage. I walked down the bright hospital corridor and stepped into the public elevator. I vastly underestimated her capacity for desperate cruelty. I did not realize that cornering a predator only makes them infinitely more dangerous. While I was driving back to my quiet estate, Rachel was frantically pacing the hospital hallway and formulating a terrifying counterattack. She realized she had lost control of her husband and the criminal narrative. She knew she could not fight me in a standard legal battle if I had a written confession and her stolen millions. She needed to completely strip me of my legal voice before Monday morning arrived. She pulled her phone from her purse and dialed a private number. She did not call a defense lawyer. She called a corrupt private physician who owed her massive financial favors. She told him she had an emergency situation regarding an elderly parent who was suffering from severe dementia and dangerous paranoid delusions. She told the doctor she needed a forced psychiatric hold and an emergency medical conservatorship drafted immediately. She was preparing to legally erase my entire existence. The final battle was not going to be fought in a criminal court. It was going to be fought in my own corporate boardroom. The weekend passed with a heavy and oppressive silence descending over my large estate. I did not leave my property. I spent Saturday evening and the entirety of Sunday sitting in my leather chair in the study. I watched the shadows stretch across the manicured lawn. I knew my daughter was not spending her weekend sitting quietly by her husband and his hospital bed. I knew her psychological profile perfectly. When Rachel feels cornered, she does not retreat, and she certainly does not surrender. She attacks the very foundation of her opponent. She realized she could no longer manipulate the narrative through tears and fake sympathy. She needed a weapon powerful enough to instantly neutralize my written evidence and my legal authority. She decided to attack the validity of my own mind. I later learned exactly how she orchestrated her desperate counterattack. She immediately contacted a man named Dr. Keller. He was not a respectable medical professional. He was a highly paid concierge physician who catered exclusively to the wealthy elite of the city. He was a man who happily wrote highly questionable prescriptions and provided convenient medical diagnoses for a premium cash fee. Rachel had introduced him to several lucrative corporate clients over the years. He owed her massive financial favors, and she decided it was the perfect time to collect his debt. She summoned him to a private meeting and laid out a completely fabricated medical history regarding my mental state. She told him I was rapidly descending into severe cognitive decline. She claimed I was suffering from the aggressive onset of Lewy body dementia. The sheer audacity of her strategy was terrifying in its brilliance. She took the absolute truth and brilliantly twisted it into a symptom of my supposed madness. She told Dr. Keller that I had recently suffered a massive psychotic break during our celebration dinner at the steakhouse. She claimed I was experiencing vivid paranoid delusions. She told him I was hallucinating wild assassination plots and completely convinced my own family was trying to poison my drinks. She weaponized the truth against me. She used the undeniable stress of the $80 million corporate buyout as the perfect catalyst for my fabricated mental collapse. Dr. Keller did not ask to examine me. He did not request any prior medical records. He simply accepted her large cash bribe and immediately drafted a comprehensive medical affidavit declaring me completely incompetent and a severe danger to myself. Rachel did not stop with the corrupt medical document. She knew she needed absolute legal authority to stop me from accessing the corporate accounts on Monday morning. She took Dr. Keller and his fraudulent affidavit directly to a sleazy civil litigation attorney who specialized in aggressive estate disputes. Together, they worked through Sunday night to draft an emergency ex parte petition for a medical and financial conservatorship. An ex parte petition is a terrifying legal maneuver. It allows one party to present their case to an emergency weekend judge without the other party even being present to defend themselves. Rachel walked into a private judicial chamber on Sunday morning, playing the role of the devastated and terrified daughter. She presented the judge with the fraudulent medical affidavit. She cried real tears and swore she was only trying to protect her wealthy father from destroying his own legacy in a fit of dementia-induced paranoia. She convinced the emergency judge that I was completely unhinged. She argued that if I was not immediately stripped of my financial power, I would likely give away the $80 million corporate buyout to absolute strangers because of my paranoid delusions. The judge looked at the tears rolling down her face and the official signature of Dr. Keller on the medical affidavit. The judge completely fell for her performance. With a single stroke of a pen, the judge granted her temporary emergency conservatorship over my entire life. That single signature legally stripped me of my fundamental human rights. Under a conservatorship, you are no longer considered a legally functioning adult. You cannot sign a valid contract. You cannot authorize a bank transfer. You cannot even refuse forced medical treatment or psychiatric confinement. Rachel was legally granted total control over my physical body and my $80 million fortune. She believed she had successfully executed a flawless legal checkmate. She thought she had completely neutralized the written confession resting securely in my suit pocket. She assumed that any evidence presented by an old man officially declared insane by a judge would be instantly dismissed by the police. She was preparing to lock me in a high-security psychiatric ward, where my claims of attempted murder would be treated as nothing more than the sad ravings of a broken mind. While she was celebrating her fraudulent legal victory on Sunday night, I was calmly drinking a cup of black tea in my study. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. I knew exactly what she was doing because I had anticipated this exact maneuver. I knew she would try to use the legal system to cage me. She was utterly convinced she was the smartest person in the room. She had absolutely no idea that I was allowing her to build her own prison. I finished my tea and prepared my suit for the morning. I knew Monday was going to be the most devastating day of her entire life. Monday morning arrived with a clear and bright sky over my estate. My mobile phone vibrated softly on the kitchen counter while I was pouring my morning coffee. It was an automated corporate calendar alert. An urgent mandatory meeting had been scheduled in the main executive boardroom for 9 in the morning. The digital meeting description simply read, "Final corporate buyout signature authorization." Rachel had scheduled the meeting herself using her executive administrative access. She was using my lifetime of dedication to the company as the perfect bait to draw me out of my secure home. She knew I would never miss the final closing meeting of my own logistics empire. She assumed I was completely ignorant of her Sunday legal maneuvers. I finished my black coffee and put on my charcoal suit jacket. I touched the inner breast pocket to feel the folded yellow pages of the confession and the solid square of the digital hard drive. I walked out to my car and drove directly toward the corporate headquarters. The massive glass skyscraper stood tall against the morning sun. I parked my car in my reserved executive space and walked through the main glass doors of the lobby. I had walked through these exact same doors every single morning for 2 decades. The lobby was usually bustling with loud logistics coordinators and busy dispatchers holding clipboards. Today, the air felt incredibly thick and strangely quiet. The employees I passed in the main corridor kept their heads down and deliberately avoided eye contact with me. Rumors always spread like wildfire in a corporate office environment. Someone had clearly instructed the entire staff to stay completely away from the executive floor this morning. I stepped into the private elevator and swiped my security badge. The metal doors closed and lifted me silently toward the penthouse suite. The elevator chimed softly and opened into the executive reception area. My loyal assistant of 15 years was not sitting at her desk. Her computer monitor was turned completely off, and her chair was pushed away into the corner. Rachel had cleared the entire floor to ensure absolute privacy for her ambush. I walked slowly down the long carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom. The silence was heavy and deeply oppressive. I reached out and pushed the heavy oak double doors open. I stepped into the massive room and looked down the length of the long mahogany table. There were no corporate buyers waiting for me with smiles and handshakes. There were no banking representatives holding the final sale documents. There were only 3 people waiting inside the room. Rachel was sitting directly at the head of the table in my custom leather chair. She was wearing a sharp designer business suit and a perfectly practiced expression of solemn duty. Sitting immediately to her right was a man I did not recognize at all. He wore a shiny gray suit and smelled heavily of cheap and overpowering cologne. His slick hair and arrogant posture practically screamed aggressive civil litigation. Standing awkwardly near the large glass windows overlooking the city was a third man. He wore a rumpled windbreaker and carried a thick manila envelope tucked tightly under his left arm. He looked incredibly nervous and kept shifting his weight from foot to foot while staring at the floor. I stood in the doorway and let the heavy oak doors click shut behind me. Rachel did not stand up to greet her father. She leaned back in my chair and steepled her fingers together in a perfect imitation of a powerful executive. She looked at the man by the window and told him to proceed with his job. The nervous man in the windbreaker walked quickly across the boardroom and stopped 2 feet in front of me. He asked in a shaking voice if my name was James. I simply nodded my head and maintained a perfectly neutral expression. He thrust the thick manila envelope into my hands and stated loudly that I had been officially served by the county court. He immediately turned around and practically ran out of the boardroom without looking back. I looked down at the heavy envelope resting heavily in my hands. I did not bother to open it. I knew exactly what fraudulent lies were printed on those pages. The sleazy attorney sitting next to my daughter stood up and aggressively buttoned his cheap suit jacket. He introduced himself as the sole legal representative for my daughter. He spoke with a loud and incredibly condescending tone, usually reserved for speaking to a confused child. He told me I was currently holding an emergency ex parte court order, signed by a superior court judge late Sunday afternoon. He explained slowly that the document was a binding temporary medical and financial conservatorship. He pointed a thick finger at me and stated that due to my rapidly declining mental state and my severe paranoid delusions, I was no longer legally permitted to make any decisions regarding my personal health or my corporate assets. He declared with absolute smugness that all of my legal rights had been completely transferred to my daughter, effective immediately. Rachel stood up from my chair and walked slowly around the long mahogany table. Her expensive heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She stopped a few feet away from me and looked at the envelope in my hands. She offered a cold and victorious smile that did not reach her eyes. She told me she was doing this entirely out of love, because my brain was clearly failing me, and she needed to protect the family legacy. She stated plainly that I was no longer the chief executive officer of the logistics company I built from nothing. She demanded that I hand over my encrypted physical security token and my master corporate keys immediately. She told me the bank was waiting for her final authorization to release the $80 million buyout funds, and she could not let my crazy paranoia ruin the monumental deal. She stood there with her hand outstretched, expecting me to shatter into a million pieces. She was waiting for the confused and terrified old man to finally surrender his empire and walk away in defeat. I kept my hands firmly at my sides and looked at her outstretched palm. I did not reach into my pocket for the encrypted security token. I did not reach for my master keys. I simply stared at her empty hand until she slowly lowered it to her side. The fake smile of a concerned daughter completely vanished from her face. Her features hardened into a mask of pure and vicious ambition. She realized I was not going to surrender quietly out of shame or confusion. She took a step closer to me and lowered her voice to a dangerous whisper. She told me I needed to understand the exact reality of my current situation. She said this was not a negotiation, and I had absolutely no leverage left to bargain with. Rachel walked back to my leather chair and picked up her expensive mobile phone from the mahogany table. She tapped the screen once and held it up for me to see. The screen displayed a live camera feed of the corporate parking lot. I could clearly see a large white medical transport van parked directly next to my reserved executive space. 2 large men wearing heavy white medical uniforms were standing next to the open back doors of the van. They were casually smoking cigarettes and waiting for a phone call. Rachel told me those men were professional psychiatric orderlies from a private behavioral health facility located 2 hours outside the city. She explained that she had already paid them a massive retainer to transport a highly combative dementia patient this morning. She laid out her ultimatum with chilling precision. She told me I had 2 very simple choices today. The first choice was complete and total cooperation. She demanded that I hand over the physical security token and provide the secondary authorization codes to release the $80 million corporate buyout funds immediately. She said if I cooperated, she would allow me to return to my quiet estate. She promised to hire a private nurse to monitor my supposed mental decline in the comfort of my own home. She said I could spend my final years reading books in my study while she managed the massive family fortune. It was a gilded cage, but she presented it as a generous act of mercy. Then she described the second option. She told me that if I refused to hand over the token right now, she would press a single button on her phone. She would summon those two massive orderlies up to the executive floor. She told me they possessed the legal authority to physically restrain me. She described exactly how they would strap my arms and legs to a heavy medical gurney. She said they would carry me out of the lobby of my own logistics empire in front of every single employee I had managed for 20 years. She painted a horrifying picture of absolute humiliation. She told me the rumors of my mental collapse would instantly become absolute fact in the eyes of the corporate world. Rachel paced slowly across the boardroom and continued her psychological torture. She described the private psychiatric facility in terrifying detail. She told me it was not a comfortable retirement home. She said it was a high-security behavioral ward designed to warehouse wealthy people who had become inconvenient to their families. She promised me the corrupt doctors on her payroll would immediately diagnose me with severe psychosis. She said they would pump my veins full of heavy chemical sedatives until I could not even remember my own name. She told me I would spend the rest of my miserable life staring blankly at a padded wall while drooling on my shirt. She said no one would ever come to visit me because she would strictly forbid all outside contact. She swore she would completely erase my existence from the world and take the $80 million anyway through the absolute power of her legal conservatorship. She mocked the decades of grueling labor I sacrificed to build this company. She told me all my early mornings and late nights were ultimately for her personal benefit. She laughed at the thought of me driving delivery trucks in the freezing rain, while she used a single piece of paper to take everything I earned. She told me I was nothing but a stubborn old fool who did not know when to politely step aside. She claimed the modern corporate world did not respect hard work anymore. She said the world only respected power and ruthlessness. She believed she possessed both of those qualities because she successfully hired a corrupt doctor and a sleazy lawyer to do her dirty work. The sleazy attorney standing near the table nodded his head in agreement. He practically bragged about the ironclad nature of the court order. He told me the legal system was entirely designed to protect the wealth of the next generation when the older generation lost their minds. He said no police officer or judge in the country would ever listen to the wild conspiracy theories of a man officially committed to a locked psychiatric ward. He told me I was completely trapped by my own legal system. He advised me to take the easy way out and give my daughter exactly what she wanted. He said fighting the conservatorship would only guarantee my swift and brutal institutionalization. I listened to every single cruel word she spoke. I let her reveal the absolute darkest corners of her greedy soul. She wanted me to feel entirely powerless. She wanted the threat of the psychiatric ward to crush my dignity. She described the heavy metal doors locking shut behind me. She described the cold linoleum floors and the harsh fluorescent lights. She told me the medical staff would strip me of my tailored suit and force me to wear a cheap paper gown. She said my legacy would not be the massive logistics network I created from nothing. She said my legacy would be a pathetic, cautionary tale of a brilliant man who finally lost his mind and had to be locked away for his own safety. Rachel walked back to me and stopped just inches from my face. She crossed her arms over her chest and stared directly into my eyes. She demanded to know what my final decision was. She asked me if I wanted to go home quietly or if I wanted to spend my final years heavily drugged and locked inside a concrete cell. She held her hand out one final time. Her fingers twitched with greedy anticipation. She warned me that the minute was almost up and the orderlies were waiting for her call. She thought she had completely backed me into an inescapable corner. She believed the sheer terror of forced institutionalization would finally break my spirit and force me to my knees. She was waiting for the frightened old man to beg for mercy. She had absolutely no idea that she was staring into the eyes of a man who had already won the war. I stood completely still and let the heavy silence stretch across the massive boardroom. I did not drop to my knees and beg for mercy. I did not shout or curse or threaten to destroy her. I simply turned my back on the sleazy lawyer and the arrogant daughter. I walked slowly toward the heavy mahogany credenza resting against the far wall of the executive suite. I picked up a heavy crystal pitcher filled with ice water. I poured the cold liquid into a glass with absolute precision. My hand did not shake. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. I raised the glass to my lips and took a long and deliberate drink. The cold water refreshed my dry throat and sharpened my focus. I placed the glass down on the wooden surface with a soft thud. I turned around and looked directly at the woman I had raised from infancy. She was staring at me with a sudden flicker of confusion, breaking through her mask of absolute confidence. She expected a terrified old man. She was looking at the chief executive officer of a national empire. I walked back to the center of the room and buttoned my suit jacket. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly calm. I told her she had just delivered a very impressive speech. I complimented her theatrical delivery and her aggressive negotiation tactics. I told her she finally sounded like a real corporate executive. Then I shattered her illusion. I told her the fundamental problem was that she was playing a dangerous game she did not actually understand. I explained that she grew up in a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and private tutors. I reminded her that her entire life was completely insulated from consequence. I told her she never had to fight for a single meal or worry about keeping the heat on in the dead of winter. I told her that because I gave her absolutely everything, she developed a fatal psychological blind spot. She believed that true power came from pieces of paper signed by corrupt judges and cheap threats delivered by hired muscle. I stepped closer to the long mahogany table. I looked at the sleazy lawyer and told him he was nothing but a parasite feeding on the manufactured drama of greedy families. I told him he had absolutely no idea what real corporate warfare actually looked like. I turned my attention back to Rachel. I explained that I built this $80 million logistics network during a time when business was settled with bloody knuckles and absolute ruthlessness. I told her I had faced down violent union strikes and predatory corporate raiders and organized crime syndicates trying to hijack my freight lines. I survived 5 decades in the most cutthroat industry in the country because I was always the most dangerous man in the room. I asked her how she could possibly believe that a fraudulent medical affidavit and 2 orderlies waiting in a parking lot could terrify a man who had stared down actual killers. Rachel took a small step backward. Her posture lost a fraction of its aggressive edge. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest to shield herself. I did not let her look away from my eyes. I told her she was a terrible student of history. I reminded her of the time a rival shipping conglomerate tried to completely bankrupt our company 15 years ago. I asked her if she remembered how I responded to that threat. I answered the question for her. I did not hire lawyers to cry in a courtroom. I systematically dismantled their entire supply chain and bought their bankrupt assets for pennies on the dollar and fired their entire executive board on Christmas Eve. I told her I did not build this massive empire by being a nice man. I built it by being incredibly patient and absolutely uncompromising. I told her she had foolishly confused my parental patience for profound weakness. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table and stopped right beside the chair she was standing next to. I spoke softly so the lawyer could not hear the venom in my words. I told her she had completely miscalculated her timeline. She assumed she had the entire weekend to set her legal trap while I was resting in bed, recovering from the shock of the poison. I told her I never experience shock. I only experience clarity. I told her she thought she was 3 steps ahead of me when in reality, she was walking completely blindfolded into a minefield I had meticulously laid for her. I asked her if she truly believed I would ever leave $80 million vulnerable to a woman who spent 5 years aggressively complaining about her inheritance. I told her I knew about her endless greed long before she ever purchased that vial of digitalis on the dark web. I told her I saw the toxic ambition rotting her soul the very day I gave her the title of vice president. I dissected her entire strategy right in front of her. I told her she always surrounded herself with weak and easily manipulated men. I pointed out that she married a pathetic coward who let her do all the thinking. I pointed at her lawyer and told her she hired a man who cared more about his cologne than his legal ethics. I told her that real leaders do not build fortresses out of corrupt doctors and spineless husbands. Real leaders stand on their own foundation. I told her she was nothing but a terrified child, wearing an expensive suit and playing with matches inside a powder keg. The lawyer cleared his throat and desperately tried to interrupt my monologue. He loudly reminded me that the court order was entirely active and my signature was no longer legally required for the bank transfer. He threatened to call the police if I did not hand over the physical security token immediately. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the man in the cheap gray suit. I told him to shut his mouth. I spoke with such heavy and absolute authority that he physically flinched and took a huge step back toward the glass windows. I told him he was completely out of his depth, and if he spoke another word, I would personally ensure he never practiced law in this state again. He swallowed hard and remained entirely silent. I turned back to my daughter. Her face had lost all of its triumphant color. Her perfect makeup could not hide the pale reality of her rising panic. She was finally beginning to realize that the old man was not trapped inside her boardroom. The old man was merely waiting for the perfect moment to completely devour her. I told Rachel she was entirely correct about one specific thing. I agreed that the modern corporate world respects absolute power and total ruthlessness. I told her I was going to teach her a final and unforgettable lesson about both of those concepts today. I told her she was incredibly proud of her legal conservatorship. I told her she thought it was the ultimate legal weapon. I explained that a conservatorship only controls assets that actually exist within the designated legal jurisdiction. I watched her eyes narrow in profound confusion. I did not explain the federal sting account yet. I wanted the psychological pressure to build until it completely crushed her spirit. I simply told her that she was currently fighting a brutal war to control an entirely empty vault. I stepped back and looked at the two of them standing awkwardly in my beautiful boardroom. I told them they were nothing but amateur thieves trying to rob an impenetrable fortress. I explained that true power does not need to shout or threaten people with psychiatric wards. True power operates in absolute silence and leaves absolutely no evidence behind. I told Rachel she had spent the entire weekend desperately building a cage to hold a lion, but she completely forgot to check if the lion was actually inside the cage. I told her she had just committed the ultimate sin of arrogance. She assumed she was the smartest person in the room, simply because she was the youngest. I told her age does not diminish a sharp intellect. Age refines it into a weapon she could never possibly comprehend. Rachel opened her mouth to speak. She tried to formulate another threat. She tried to summon the angry and entitled executive, but her voice completely failed her. Her manicured hands were shaking visibly against the smooth edge of the mahogany table. The chilling reality of my total calm was finally breaking through her delusions of grandeur. She reached for her mobile phone to call the professional orderlies waiting in the parking lot. I did not try to stop her. I simply smiled a cold and genuine smile. I told her to make the phone call right now. I told her to summon her hired muscles up to the penthouse suite. I told her she was going to desperately need someone to carry her out of this building when the absolute reality of her situation finally destroyed her life forever. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold plastic of the boardroom control panel remote. The time for talking was completely over. The time for total and absolute annihilation had arrived. I pressed my thumb firmly against the small black button on the plastic remote. A sharp electronic beep echoed through the silent boardroom. The heavy electronic deadbolts on the massive oak doors disengaged with a loud and heavy click. Rachel jumped slightly at the sudden noise. She turned her head away from me and stared at the entrance of the boardroom. The heavy wooden doors slowly swung outward into the main reception hallway. The silence of the executive suite was instantly shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps marching across the carpeted floor. The first person to walk through the doorway was Lawson. My attorney did not look like a man who had been awake for 48 straight hours. He wore a pristine navy blue suit and carried a thick black leather briefcase in his right hand. His posture was perfectly straight, and his expression was completely devoid of mercy. He walked into the room with the absolute authority of a man who held all the winning cards. Rachel stared at him in profound confusion. She recognized Lawson immediately, but she could not understand why my corporate attorney was walking into her private ambush. Her confusion lasted for exactly 2 seconds before the real cavalry entered the room. Behind Lawson came a highly organized wave of absolute legal destruction. 4 men and 2 women marched into the boardroom with calculated precision. They did not wear cheap gray suits or carry fake court orders. 3 of them wore dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their backs. They were elite agents from the Financial Crimes Task Force. Following closely behind the federal agents were 2 seasoned homicide detectives from the local city precinct. Their gold badges were clearly visible on their belts right next to their heavy service weapons. They fanned out across the massive room in absolute silence. They moved with the terrifying efficiency of predators surrounding their trapped prey. One federal agent immediately stepped in front of the heavy oak doors and blocked the only exit. Another agent walked swiftly over to the large glass windows and stood directly behind the sleazy civil litigation attorney. The lawyer physically shrank away from the federal agent. His arrogant posture collapsed completely. He pressed his back against the glass and raised his hands slightly in the air to show he was not a physical threat. Rachel was entirely paralyzed. She stood frozen next to my leather chair. Her manicured hands remained suspended in the air. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. She looked back and forth between the federal agents and the local police detectives. The reality of her total destruction was finally materializing right in front of her eyes. The lead federal agent walked to the center of the mahogany table. He was a tall man with graying hair and a deeply serious expression. He looked directly at Rachel and asked her to confirm her legal identity. Rachel could only manage a pathetic and weak nod of her head. The agent did not smile. He stated in a loud and clear voice that this corporate boardroom was now an active federal crime scene. He instructed everyone in the room to keep their hands completely visible and to refrain from making any sudden movements. The sheer weight of his authoritative voice sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. The power dynamic shifted so violently and so permanently that the air actually felt heavy. Lawson walked around the large mahogany table and stood proudly by my side. He looked at the sleazy attorney cowering by the window. Lawson pointed a steady finger at the man and asked him to present his legal credentials. The sleazy lawyer stammered uncontrollably. His voice cracked as he tried to explain that he was simply executing a court-ordered medical conservatorship on behalf of a concerned family member. He desperately tried to distance himself from the criminal situation unfolding in front of him. He claimed he had absolutely no idea why the federal authorities were raiding a standard civil estate dispute. Lawson let out a sharp bark of laughter. He placed his heavy leather briefcase onto the smooth wooden surface of the table. He looked at the sleazy lawyer and informed him that the ex parte petition he filed on Sunday afternoon was based entirely on a fraudulent medical affidavit signed by a deeply corrupt physician. Lawson explained that Dr. Keller was currently sitting in a concrete interrogation room downtown, explicitly detailing how much cash Rachel had paid him to fabricate the dementia diagnosis. Lawson told the terrified lawyer that his emergency court order was legally void and entirely worthless. He advised the man to remain absolutely silent if he wanted to maintain any hope of keeping his legal license or avoiding federal conspiracy charges himself. The lawyer instantly shut his mouth and stared at the floor. He realized his greed had just dragged him into a massive federal indictment. Rachel finally found her voice. It was a weak and trembling whisper completely stripped of her previous entitlement. She looked at the lead federal agent and tried to summon her fake tears. She begged the agent to listen to her. She claimed I was suffering from severe paranoia and that I had somehow managed to manipulate my corporate attorney into bringing armed police officers to harass a concerned daughter. She pointed a shaking finger at me and told the agent I belonged in a psychiatric hospital. The lead federal agent did not look at me. He kept his cold eyes locked firmly on Rachel. He told her she was under official investigation for massive corporate wire fraud and the first-degree attempted murder of her own father. He stated that they were fully aware of the Cayman Islands shell company and the lethal digitalis she poured into my drink at the steakhouse. The federal agent told her to put her hands flat on the mahogany table. Rachel stumbled backward until her legs hit the heavy wooden chair. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed heavily into the chair and let out a long and agonizing wail of pure despair. The absolute finality of the raid crushed her completely. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. She expected me to intervene and save her from the federal authorities. She expected the father who had protected her for her entire life to step forward and stop the nightmare. I stood perfectly still with my hands at my sides. I looked down at her terrified face with absolute emotional detachment. I did not feel pity. I did not feel regret. I simply nodded my head toward Lawson. I told my loyal attorney it was time to show them exactly why they were never going to see the outside of a prison cell again. Lawson placed his heavy leather briefcase flat on the polished mahogany surface of the boardroom table. The loud metallic clicks of the brass locks opening echoed through the silent room like the cocking of a heavy firearm. Everyone watched him with absolute undivided attention. He lifted the leather lid and slowly extracted a thick stack of printed financial documents. He did not rush his movements. He operated with the terrifying patience of an executioner preparing the final drop. He placed the heavy stack of papers precisely in the center of the table and smoothed the top page with his right hand. He looked directly into the terrified eyes of my daughter. He told her those pages contained the complete digital forensics of her massive corporate theft. Lawson began to methodically explain exactly what the federal agents had been monitoring all weekend long. He detailed her unauthorized secondary authorization login. He highlighted the forged digital executive signature she had applied while her husband was choking on the floor of the steakhouse. He read aloud the exact routing numbers for her untraceable shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Rachel stared at the papers with incredibly wide eyes. She tried desperately to deny it. She whispered that the transfer was a legitimate corporate investment strategy that I had forgotten about. Lawson did not let her finish her pathetic lie. He leaned forward and delivered the killing blow to her financial fantasy. He told her the $15 million never actually reached the Caribbean bank. He explained how we legally hijacked the outbound transfer in the middle of the night. He told her the money had been seamlessly deposited directly into a locked Federal Reserve holding account. The lead federal agent stepped forward and nodded his head to confirm the statement. The agent told her she was currently completely broke and facing decades in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and corporate wire fraud. The air rushed out of her lungs in a sharp and ragged gasp. The financial documents destroyed her future, but the trap was not fully sprung. I reached slowly into my inside suit jacket pocket. My fingers brushed against the cold plastic of the external hard drive. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the wooden table right next to the stack of banking records. Lawson pointed a steady finger at the small black device. He informed the local police detectives exactly what the drive contained. He told them it held the unedited high-definition security footage from the private dining room. He looked back at Rachel and described the exact sequence of events captured on the digital video. He told her the camera clearly recorded her reaching into her expensive designer purse. He stated that the video showed her husband deliberately shifting his heavy chair to create a visual blind spot from the main dining room. He told her the camera captured the exact second she unscrewed the cap and poured the lethal dose of liquid digitalis directly into my premium bourbon. The two local homicide detectives immediately stepped closer to the table and stared at the hard drive with intense professional interest. Rachel began to shake violently. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach as if she were going to be physically sick. She knew the video was absolute and undeniable proof of her attempted murder. She could no longer claim it was a sudden medical episode. She could no longer blame an anonymous restaurant worker. The digital eye had captured her pure malice with perfect clarity. The financial records completely destroyed her alibi for the money. The video footage completely destroyed her alibi for the poison. I was finally ready to completely destroy her spirit. I reached into my suit pocket one final time. I pulled out the 3 folded pages of yellow legal paper. I handed them directly to Lawson. He took the heavy pages and slowly unfolded them. The crisp sound of the paper tearing through the heavy silence of the boardroom felt like the final nail being driven into her coffin. Lawson smoothed the yellow pages flat next to the financial records and the digital hard drive. He looked down at Rachel and told her this was the most devastating piece of evidence on the entire table. He told her it was a full and voluntary written confession. Rachel stared at the yellow paper and her breathing became incredibly shallow. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Lawson cleared his throat and began to read the terrifying words aloud. He read her husband and his full legal name. He read the exact date and the precise time the document was signed in the intensive care unit. He read the detailed description of how she meticulously manipulated her husband into helping her execute the assassination plot. He read the specific details about purchasing the lethal poison from an anonymous vendor on the dark web. He read the pathetic and desperate excuses her husband wrote down just to save his own skin. Lawson made absolutely sure every single person in the boardroom heard exactly how quickly Brian had traded his own wife for the promise of a lighter prison sentence. Rachel covered her ears with her trembling hands. She did not want to hear the words. She did not want to face the absolute reality of her complete betrayal. The man she loved had sold her to the authorities without a second thought, the moment his own freedom was threatened. I looked at her sitting in my corporate chair, completely broken and entirely defeated. She had walked into this boardroom less than an hour ago, believing she was an unstoppable force of nature. She believed she could use a fraudulent court order to cage me and steal my entire legacy. Now she was staring directly at a massive mountain of irrefutable evidence that guaranteed she would spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a concrete cell. The trap was perfectly executed. The evidence was absolute. Every single lie she had meticulously crafted over the weekend was burned entirely to the ground in less than 5 minutes. The sleazy attorney standing by the window stared at the yellow pages resting on the mahogany table. The arrogant smirk he wore when he handed me the fraudulent court order had completely vanished. He looked at the federal agents, and then he looked down at his own trembling hands. He was a man who made his living by bullying frightened families in civil court, but he had absolutely no experience dealing with federal criminal indictments. He realized in a matter of seconds that his wealthy client had just dragged him into a massive conspiracy involving attempted murder and international wire fraud. He did not hesitate to save himself. He stepped away from the glass window and walked quickly toward the center of the room. He completely ignored Rachel and spoke directly to the lead federal agent. He stated in a loud and shaking voice that he was formally withdrawing his legal representation of his client effective immediately. He claimed he was completely deceived by her lies and insisted he had absolutely no knowledge of the poisoned bourbon or the stolen offshore funds. He pointed a trembling finger at Rachel and declared that she had provided him with the fabricated medical affidavit entirely on her own. He practically begged the federal agents to view him as a cooperative witness rather than a criminal accomplice. Rachel snapped her head up and stared at the lawyer in absolute disbelief. The last remaining pillar of her defense had just collapsed and crushed her underneath it. She realized she was entirely alone in a room full of federal agents and police detectives. The profound shock that had paralyzed her moments ago rapidly mutated into an explosive and entitled rage. She leaped out of the heavy leather chair and lunged toward the attorney. She screamed that she had paid him an exorbitant retainer to protect her and demanded that he do his job. The federal agent standing near the door stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder to stop her advance. Rachel violently shoved the hand of the agent away and turned her fury toward me, her face contorted into a mask of pure and unfiltered hatred. She completely abandoned the act of the concerned daughter. She shouted that I was a stubborn old dinosaur who refused to simply die and pass on the wealth she rightfully deserved. She screamed that she had wasted the best years of her life pretending to care about my boring logistics company just to secure her inheritance. She yelled that I owed her the $80 million for forcing her to endure my conservative business lectures and my endless stories about the early days of the company. I stood perfectly still and let her scream until her throat was completely raw. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal. I simply let the federal agents and the local police detectives listen to her, confess her motive in her own furious words. Her sense of entitlement was so massive that she genuinely believed she was the victim of this situation. The lead federal agent had heard enough of her hysterical screaming. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed sharply across the large boardroom. He ordered Rachel to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Rachel froze for a fraction of a second as she stared at the cold metal rings. Then she began to thrash and fight like a cornered wild animal. She kicked her expensive designer shoes at the shins of the agents. She swung her arms wildly and tried to scratch the face of the detective standing next to her. She shrieked that they could not arrest her because she was the vice president of finance, and she demanded to speak to the chief of police. Her pathetic display of physical resistance lasted less than 10 seconds. The highly trained federal agents easily overpowered her frail and untrained body. 2 agents grabbed her flailing arms and swiftly twisted them behind her back. They pressed her firmly against the smooth surface of the mahogany table. She pressed her face against the polished wood and sobbed uncontrollably as the heavy steel cuffs were ratcheted tightly around her delicate wrists. The sharp clicking sound of the locking mechanism signaled the absolute end of her wealthy and privileged life. The lead federal agent leaned close to her ear and recited her legal rights in a calm and detached voice. He informed her that anything she said would absolutely be used against her in a court of law. He told her she had the right to remain silent, but she was currently completely incapable of shutting her mouth. She continued to sob and curse and threaten everyone in the room with massive lawsuits as the agents pulled her roughly to her feet. The sleazy attorney used the chaotic distraction to quickly pack his briefcase. He snapped the brass locks shut and practically sprinted out of the boardroom doors before the detectives could ask him any more questions. I knew the authorities would eventually track him down and strip him of his legal license, but I did not care about him today. I only cared about the woman standing in handcuffs at the end of my table. Rachel looked at me with mascara running down her face in thick black lines. She pleaded with me to stop the agents. She begged me to remember that she was my only child. She asked me how a father could possibly send his own daughter to a federal prison. I looked into her desperate eyes and delivered my final verbal blow. I told her the daughter I loved had died a long time ago, and the criminal standing in my boardroom was a total stranger who just happened to wear her face. I told the federal agents to get her out of my sight. The agents grabbed her by the arms and began to march her toward the heavy oak doors. She dragged her feet against the thick corporate carpet in a pathetic attempt to slow them down, but they pulled her forward relentlessly. She turned her head back one final time as they pushed her through the doorway. Her eyes were completely wide with sheer terror as she finally realized that her father was never going to save her. I watched her disappear into the main reception hallway. The local homicide detectives carefully collected the yellow legal pad and the external hard drive and the printed financial documents. They placed the evidence into thick manila envelopes and secured them properly. They thanked me for my profound cooperation and quietly left the room. Lawson and I were finally alone in the massive executive suite. The suffocating tension of the morning entirely evaporated. The trap had successfully snapped shut, and the predators had been permanently removed from the premises. I walked slowly toward the massive glass windows overlooking the city street. The morning sun was bright and blinding. I looked down at the concrete parking lot directly in front of the corporate lobby. I watched the heavy glass doors slide open. 2 federal agents walked out into the bright sunlight. They were holding my daughter tightly by her arms. Her head was bowed completely down. She was no longer fighting or screaming or demanding to speak to the chief of police. The absolute reality of her situation had finally crushed her arrogant spirit. I watched them guide her toward the back of a dark police cruiser. An agent placed his hand on the top of her head and pushed her down into the cramped back seat. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a finality that echoed even up in the penthouse. Right next to the police cruiser, I saw the white medical transport van. The 2 professional orderlies finally realized their wealthy client had just been arrested by the federal government. They threw their cigarettes onto the concrete and drove away entirely empty-handed. The terrifying psychiatric cage she built for me was gone forever. I turned away from the bright window and walked back to the center of the boardroom. Lawson was standing quietly by the mahogany table. He had cleared away all the printed criminal evidence and the digital hard drive. He opened his leather briefcase one final time. He pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents. These were not fraudulent court orders or forged bank transfers. These were the legitimate final authorization papers for the $80 million corporate buyout. Lawson placed a heavy silver pen next to the documents. He looked at me and asked if I was absolutely ready to make the final move. I told him I had never been more ready in my entire life. I sat down in my leather executive chair. I picked up the silver pen and began to sign my legal name on the dotted lines. I did not transfer the $80 million into my personal banking accounts. I knew that leaving a massive fortune sitting idle would only attract more parasites and greedy opportunists in the future. I instructed Lawson to draft a completely unbreakable philanthropic trust. I directed the entire $80 million to be locked permanently into a private educational foundation. The money would be used exclusively to build schools and provide scholarships for underprivileged children across the country. I spent my entire life building an empire to provide for a daughter who ultimately tried to murder me for an early inheritance. I decided my legacy would not be defined by her incredible greed and betrayal. My legacy would be defined by giving thousands of innocent children the exact financial opportunities my own daughter so violently threw away. I signed the final page of the trust agreement. The ink dried quickly on the heavy paper. The money was completely safe and entirely out of reach forever. The weeks following the boardroom ambush moved swiftly. The federal prosecutors were absolutely ruthless in their pursuit of justice. Brian honored his written agreement to save himself from maximum security. He testified against his wife in federal court and officially pled guilty to his role in the conspiracy. He received a reduced sentence of 10 years in a minimum security facility, just as I promised. Rachel did not receive any mercy from the legal system. The federal judge denied her bail completely, citing her extreme flight risk and the massive scale of her financial crimes. She was transferred directly to a maximum security federal detention center to await her criminal trial. Her court-appointed public defender told the media she is facing a minimum of 40 years in prison for attempted murder and corporate wire fraud. She sends me letters from her concrete cell every single week begging for my forgiveness. I never open them. I instruct my housekeeper to throw them directly into the burning fireplace. True family is built on mutual respect and absolute loyalty. I refuse to entertain the pathetic apologies of a convicted monster. I stood up from my executive chair and shook hands with Lawson. I thanked him for his decades of brilliant legal counsel and his unwavering loyalty during the darkest weekend of my life. I picked up my coat and walked out of the massive boardroom for the very last time. I rode the private elevator down to the main lobby. The corporate employees watched me walk through the glass doors, but I did not stop to explain anything to anyone. My time as a logistics executive was completely over. I stepped out into the warm morning air. I took a deep breath of the clean city wind. I did not feel like a victim. I did not feel like a tired old man recovering from a brutal betrayal. I felt a profound and absolute sense of total freedom. The empire was sold. The traitors were locked away in federal cages. My life was finally entirely my own again. I walked toward my car with a light heart and a clear mind, ready to begin the next chapter of my journey. What did you learn from my story today? I learned that true power does not come from screaming or making empty threats. I learned that true power is the ability to remain absolutely calm when the people you trust the most decide to betray you. I learned that you must always protect your own life and your own legacy, even if it means destroying the people you once loved. Did you agree with how I handled my greedy daughter and her weak husband? Let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. If you found value in my journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can continue sharing these important life lessons. You can also support my work by sending a super thanks. On the screen, you will see 2 more incredible life stories that I highly recommend. Thank you so much for your sweet support and your time. I will see you in the next story.